one of the main benefits to it is that it does give you a little bit more flexibility to graze and to manage land compared to traditional fencing. Uh, Fences work fairly well, have worked for millennia, I guess. I don't know how many years have we no fences, right? But once you create that fence, the traditional fence, you put it in place, you're set to that location. You have very little room unless you redo all those fences to move animals around. With the virtual fencing, you have that flexibility to manage your grazing to where you have more biomass or more nutritional quality forages and things like that.
Welcome to the Beef Podcast, brought to you by Wisenetics. I'm your host, Brandy Buzzard, and it's my pleasure to bring you the latest trends and issues from the best and brightest minds in the beef industry. Today, we are joined by Dr. Juliana Ranches, Assistant Professor and Extension Beef Specialist at Oregon State University. Dr. Ranches earned her master's and PhD from the University of Florida and currently works on mineral research and methane emissions work within cattle, as well as many other factors that we're going to talk about today. I'm really excited to talk to her about some new hot button issues that have burst onto the scene with fencing in the beef industry. And so with that, let's get right to it. Dr. Ranches, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
Hi, Brandy. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you guys.
Well, I know that you have been a guest on the podcast before, but not with me. You were with our other host, Dr. Mullenix. But for our audience who haven't listened to that episode and don't know very much about you, if you could just start off with to bring us up to speed on your background, your career, how you got started in the beef industry, and just where you got to today through your career trajectory, that would be wonderful.
So I'm Juliana Ranches. I'm Assistant Professor and Beef Extension Specialist at Oregon State University. I'm actually based in Eastern Oregon in a research center here in Burns. And I am actually from Brazil, so there's a little bit of accent there. I did my master's and PhD at University of Florida. I was trained in mineral nutrition, and in 2020 I moved to Oregon. And since I got here, I've been working still in trace minerals, mineral nutrition, vitamins. Start to work on methane mitigation, methane emissions of grazing cattle. Did quite a bit of work on virtual fencing. Our group here has worked on that area on the last few years, and I think that's primarily what we're going to talk about today. And on my last time here on the podcast, I talked to Travis about our work on smoke exposure from wildfires.
Everyone knows vitamin D affects bone formation, immunity, and growth. What everyone doesn't know is research shows cattle don't get enough vitamin D. High D from DSM Firmenich optimizes health and growth with a more bioavailable form of vitamin D. And data shows high D fed heifers weighed over 8 pounds more at weaning. Don't let your cattle be vitamin deficient. Meet the growing needs of your herd year-round with high D. Learn more at dsm-firmenich.com/hy-d.
Those are a wide host of a broad host of topics ranging there from mineral to wildfires and things like that, which kind of is a nice segue into one of the things that you're researching now in terms of wildfires and regrowth, and then like making sure that fuel for wildfires, is minimized. And that's virtual fencing, which has really broken onto the scene lately in the beef industry. I've noticed the conversations around virtual fencing just exploding like in the last 6 months. And so I'm just, kind of talk to us about what virtual fencing is, and then maybe some of the benefits of it.
Yeah, so virtual fencing, if people are not familiar with that yet, is actually a way to contain cattle without physical barriers. Right now, there's different virtual fences in the market. We work initially with vans. They all work fairly similar. But vans works with a collar. So a cow has to wear that collar. That collar will connect to a tower, and the tower connects to satellites. And we also have a software. So in that software, you can design your fences, so your virtual fences, where you want to contain or exclude cattle from. So that's the whole point of it. So you have a GPS coordinate where you design those boundaries, And based on the communication between collars, satellite, and towers, we have those boundaries defined within a specific area. And and I think you asked about benefits too, right?
Yeah, some of the benefits,
So
like, yeah.
yeah, I think like one of the main benefits to it is that it does give you a little bit more flexibility to graze and to manage land compared to traditional fencing. I mean, fences work fairly well, have worked for millennia, I guess. I don't know how many years have we know fences,
Yeah.
right? But once you create that fence, the traditional fence, you put it in place, you're set to that location. You have very little room unless you redo all those fences to
Hmm.
move animals around. With the virtual fencing, you have that flexibility to manage your grazing to where you have more biomass or more nutritional quality forages and things like that. Tying to the wildfire situation, that's another thing we've seen a lot of producers being very happy about it is that you have the ability to easily find your animals. For us that graze in large areas of pastures, that's very beneficial. So you can look on your phone, you can look in your computer, and very easily you can find those animals. So I've heard stories from producers recently that they were only able to save their herd during a wildfire situation because they were using virtual fencing. So you can easily go on your phone and say like, hey, my cows are 10 miles from here, save you time to try to figure out where they are at, right?
It's such a novel concept is not the right option, but it's something that, I mean, requires a little bit more like in-depth thinking, I guess, like a little bit more critical thinking about where you want to set, from your device of these fences, and you may have to do it more often, but it really can be a valuable tool to help with that prevention. And I'm sure it's similar in Oregon, but in here in Kansas, like wildfires are a very real threat, and being able to help get some of that fuel grazed down and some of that dry matter, that's really helpful. And another, personally, before the virtual fencing kind of really came onto the scene really strongly these last few months, I had only really heard of it like using it to keep cattle away from areas. So like keep cattle away from riparian areas so that those can like flourish and be repaired. But it's really interesting to hear it be used now to keep cattle contained in a spot. And so I just think it's really, really interesting. How did virtual fencing get started there at the Eastern Oregon Research and Agriculture Center? Was that something that you initiated, or how did that come about?
Yeah, no, I wasn't actually the person who initiated. So I got here in 2020 and they were just getting started to work with virtual fencing. And I was invited to be part of the group and they were talking about it. And I was like, I'm going to say yes just because I just got here, right? Like you feel that pressure to participate and say yes to everything. But in my mind, I was like, this is never going to work because, well, the principle of virtual fencing is that you contain or exclude an animal from an area based on behavioral instinct. So there is a beep. So as soon as that animal get close to that boundary, there's going to be an audio cue so the animal can move back to where it's supposed to be at. And if the animal continues to go, there will be a shock. And in my mind I was like, there's no way this is gonna work, but then like I was very surprised it worked. So our first trial was actually similar to what you mentioned, to prevent animals from getting in an area. So we were simulating an area that had recently been burned by wildfire. So here we have regulations that prevent us from grazing recently burned areas. So I think the depending on the area can go up to 2 years. So if there's a fire, up to 2 years of no grazing. So we have very large areas, so very large pastures, and the idea was to use virtual fence to fence it out one portion of that pasture and see if we would prevent grazing. So that was actually our first study. That was with Dr. Chad Boyd from USDA. And basically, we put collars. We had about 25% of the pastures burned, and we put collars on cows in all the cows, but we had control in virtual fence collars on. So the control cows had the virtual fence collars off. And basically, we look at the grazing and the consumption of the burned area when they had the ability to go there because their colors were off and when they were preventing from going there. And we saw like negligible grazing activity within the burned area for the cows that had the collars on, while the cows that were our control cows, they could have access to it. They basically grazed all that area and eliminated all the regrowth of that area, right? So we saw very significant results on the virtual fence preventing those animals from getting on those recently burned areas. So it was very effective at that point. And then another study we did was looking into creating fuel breaks, actually. So like removing biomass, as you mentioned earlier. So this is another study was led by Dr. Chad Boyd, and he was interested in creating a fire break within a larger pasture by utilizing grazing. So we gave animals a larger pasture, but we confined them to a smaller area within that pasture and asked, we hope for a forage utilization of 40 to 60%. So we got to the ground and we actually cleared that area within the pasture. So that was, again, another very effective way to use the virtual fencing.
You said there that the cows were eating the regrowth without the cows with no collars and that weren't part of the virtual fencing were eating the regrowth, and they will snap that fresh grass right up.
They will. I think in 4 days, I remember it was something like less than a week. I don't remember the exact number, but less than a week, there was no forage available in those recently burned areas because the cows that had access to it, they like it, right? Like they love it. So they consume everything. Yeah. While the cows that were in the virtual fence collars, they tested, they went there once, they realized they were like, I should not be here. So they get back to where they were.
It's just funny to me. I mean, it's not funny. It's just a proof point that like for the pure proof point for the virtual fencing, and also that cows will eat, they will ruin all of they'll just take all your good grass and not share it. So, yes, but that's just a nice proof point of piece of research. Where do you see kind of future work going with the virtual fencing? Like, is this something you think is going to be widely adopted on all ranches? What do you think about it? Where do you see it going?
I would just step back a little bit to some of the behavior and physiology work we did. So because when we started working with virtual fencing, I wasn't a believer at the beginning, let's put it that way. And then I saw it works. And then I was concerned about the animal welfare situation, right? So I wanted to understand if we would have any negative impact physiologically or behaviorally. So we did some studies to look at if the use of virtual fence would negatively impact cattle behavior. So we did several runs in an arena and observed the behavior, and we didn't see any changes. Of course, there's minor changes when they're first collared, but that happens to any type of collars. But there was nothing negative, right? So we were confident that this does not change cattle behavior when they're collared and when they have that pressure to stay in that location. And also on the physiology side, we look at some markers such as cortisol, haptoglobin, so acute phase proteins. And we also didn't see anything that was negative. There was no increases in cortisol when they were collared or no increases in any of those acute phase markers. So we're confident that it doesn't necessarily negatively impact the behavior or the physiology if you think about, they're getting a shock. Right. And we also look at those values over time. We look at how many cues an animal get over time, and we saw that within a week they're getting less than a shock a day. So they rely primarily on the auditory cue, not necessarily on the shock. So they quickly learn to use that to their benefit, right? Yeah. And with that, one of the questions we are getting very often now is how many cows needs to be collared within a herd.
Oh, okay.
because there is a cost, right? So
Yeah.
we want to understand. So moving forward, where we are going is looking into cattle personality. We want to understand if there's a type of cow that might not be your best fit for that type of technology. So we're going to be doing some behavioral evaluations again to understand if you maybe you have a cow that's a little bit more flighty or something like that, and she's not going to be a good candidate, and she's probably gonna, if you decide to collar everybody else, maybe she should not be collar, or she should be collar, and others that are more of a social type of behavior that will follow the whole herd maybe don't need the collar. So that's where we're going next, to try to understand if there's any way to predict who would be a good cow to be collared, and how many cows in a herd should be collared.
I love that behavioral outcome where, it shows that they got notified or shocked many times at the beginning, and then they learned pretty quick to like stay away from the borders. Something I learned, once we had cattle and stuff, is that like a calf, it will always come back to its mother. Like if it gets away, like it, squirts out a fence or something, it's going to try to get back. Do you have any experience, or maybe not experience, but observations of like where a calf went outside of the barrier? Because the calves don't wear collars, but so they could get outside of it. Do you have any observations of the calves getting out of the barrier, maybe the cows trying to go after them? Like how has that affected the herds? And surely that has a little bit of effect on the well-being of a cow if she can't get to her calf. Can you speak about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, actually, this is something that happened to us on our field break study. We typically don't collar cows because they're growing, so it's difficult to, uh, properly collar it in a way that you have room for them to grow and not lose the collar. So that's a challenge, still a challenge, I believe, for all the companies at this point. But in this study, the field break study that I was talking earlier, we confined the animals within a smaller area in the pasture, and we actually had two groups of cows. So we had dry cows with no calves, and we have mama cows with their calves that were close to him, so they were big calves. And we noticed that there was some cows that were breaking the boundaries often, and we wonder why. And then we realized it was because calves were leaving that enclosed space, because forage, as we were trying to clean the ground, right, like make that field break, forage was becoming a limitation. So the calves start to go out, and so we would see the cows to go after the calves too. Uh, and we did not see that for the dry cows; they remained there. So there's definitely a pressure from the calf side, to, the cow will go try to find it. So I think if you are in a situation where you're collaring cow calf, so you're gonna collar just the cows, you need to make sure there's no nutritional limitations. So make sure they have access to water where they are at, or supplements, and your pasture availability is enough for that herd you're managing there. Otherwise, the animals that are not collared are likely to leave that location, and the ones that are collared will try to follow them. So that's definitely important.
That makes sense. So we have a Labrador that we tried virtual fencing with. And Labradors, if you've ever had a Labrador, they wander. And he just would ignore the virtual fence. It wasn't a strong enough little bump on his neck, and he would just ignore it. And now he only has 3 legs. But have you found, the reason I asked that is, have you found that once the cows, like if they're in the area long enough, that they kind of have an idea of like, I know that tree is kind of close to where I got that little spark last time. Have you noticed that once they have established and they know the boundaries, that they will just kind of self-mediate and stay even further away from it?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So a little bit on the memory, right? Like how long they remember that not so great experience. On our first behavior study, we did look into that a little bit. So we would collar cows and put them in this arena that had a feed attractant right in the middle. So we would the feed attractant was like actually behind the virtual fence boundary. So it was just, we made them to want to be there, but they couldn't be there, right? Like there was this huge alfalfa bale for one single cow. So they were like, yeah, I want to go there. So on the first run, they could go freely there, like they were like could bite, could eat that alfalfa, and then we would kick them out from that testing arena. Then we would put the collars and then see if the collar would prevent them from getting into that feed, and it did. And then on our last run, we'd remove the collars and we put the cows in there again to be like, hey, do you trust? Would you go? So I think we had 11 animals on that trial. It was a smaller trial. We did 5 runs for each cows. We had most of the cows to go again to that location. So some of them had a little bit of aversion, but if we encouraged them to go, they would go. In this situation, those animals, they were alone. It was one cow tested each time. So I would assume that in a grazing situation, it's probably, I don't think the aversion would last. And if they have a herd with them, they will probably just go over it. So I've heard other people saying different, that there is an aversion or something like that. But I feel like this is also to the level of cattle, going back to the use of the word personality, but a little bit of personality. If you have an animal that's a little bit more scary and things like that, that might be more averse to that location. But in general, I would say that we don't see anything negative of like preventing animals from getting to that location again.
I just think it's interesting because, animals are different, just like people, and some of them have their own ideas and their own, I'm going to do what I want. And some of them are much more respectful of the boundary. So that's interesting, something I was curious about. So I know that you don't only work on virtual fencing. You've told us that a couple times here, but you do a lot of work in behavior and physiology as well. What, aside from virtual fencing, what are you excited about or working on right now, at the EORAC? I think I said that right. EORAC.
Yeah, EORAC. So technically right now for virtual fencing, we're going to start this personality testing and see if we can figure out who should wear collars or not. And that goes back to maternal ability. So we start that study looking at cows that have different maternal ability scores, and then we're gonna look at some behaviors during, like, very similar to what we did, like several runs that we do, novel presentations, startle tests, and come up with an index to see like, hey, this cow is a good candidate, this cow is not a good candidate. So that's where we're going with virtual fencing. We're probably gonna add some physiology measurements there too. And then overall, we've been like, the methane study is something that runs the year long. We're trying to understand the differences in methane emissions throughout the year for cows that are grazing. And we actually happen to be using virtual fence in that study, but to us here, it became a management tool. It's not really necessarily part of the study. We're just using to manage cows. So in that study, it's a larger pasture. So we're grazing it, not really a rotational grazing, but we're strategically grazing those pastures to match the quality over seasons and see how that affects the methane emissions. And then we also have a lot of the smoke exposure studies coming up this fall, where we're going to be testing some electrolytes and nutrition interventions to see if we reduce the negative impacts of smoke exposure.
Oh, well, again, very important. There's a lot of very important outcomes around wildfires and having to do with not only the smoke exposure, but then preventing them. So, unfortunately, it seems Eastern Oregon is probably a good place to research that, although that's not something that you want to hear.
Yes. We do get quite a bit of fires every year. And I think, I don't know if I said that at the beginning or if we're just our conversation, virtual fence has been very, very beneficial to producers here on those situations, because in those emergencies, they can easily go and find their animals. So It's another benefit of it for sure.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. But if you have the virtual fencing, you know exactly where they are or, should be in that area. That's that's a benefit I hadn't even considered at all. That's a really big benefit for sure.
Yeah, everybody that's using it. We had a few producers last year that mentioned that they were only able to save their herds because they were exactly what they are. So it was quick to get to them, to remove them from that location.
I mean, that's a powerful proof point or selling point, I guess, of why why a rancher may want to adopt it. Because I mean, the difference between saving your herd and not having a herd, that's a pretty big difference.
Yeah, right.
I just want to remind our audience here through the middle of the episode that if you're enjoying this episode of the Beef Podcast presented by Wisenetics, please remember to like, subscribe, and share with your friends and family. This one particularly, if they are interested in virtual fencing and installing that or adopting that behavioral tool on their ranch. Dr. Ranches, I do want to ask you, behavior and physiology are things that are evolving. We learn. My master's degree is in animal behavior and well-being, and the things that we looked at when I was getting my master's are very different topics are being looked at now because we continually learn more and base future research off learnings from past research. So, what is your big dream research or kind of big goal for the beef industry and animal, cattle well-being, if you were to name one thing?
I don't know if I have that goal in virtual fencing. Maybe virtual fencing would be to find to help producers. Like, do we need to collar 100% of the herd? I think if we can collar half of it, that would be beneficial to producers, beneficial to cattle too, and it still has a good management of that. And then I think on the smoke exposure side, maybe that's where I have more of the well-being and welfare of the animals. We're seeing also a lot of producers that are treating cattle with antibiotics, for example, during smoke exposure, because the signs of smoke exposure is very similar. The visual signs are very similar to BRD. So we have droopy ears, runny nose, they cough, but not necessarily they have any respiratory issue. It's more like they were exposed to smoke. If you've been exposed to smoke during wildfires, you're going to have the same symptoms. You're going to have headache, your eyes going to be very watery, you might be coughing and stuff like that, but not necessarily you have a virus or a bacteria and are developing a disease, right? So where I want to go is I want to develop a way to differentiate both. Is it your animal is really sick? Do you have a case of BRD on your property right now? Or is this what we're seeing is just because they were exposed to smoke? So I think that might be where I would like to go on animal welfare and animal behavior well-being in terms of research, trying to differentiate those.
Yeah, that's, again, something I just had never thought of. I mean, thank you for sharing that vision. But it's not something I ever thought of. When we hear about wildfire, my thoughts are always I hope the cattle were safe, and that you always, you're concerned, did they get any burns as they were, did they get burned in the process, their hoof, things like that. And it just it sounds very naive of me, but I just had never thought of the residual coughing and eye burning thing like that. Never thought of that. Thankfully, knock on wood, I've never had a wildfire here where we live. We live on the eastern side of the state, but definitely in the western part of Kansas and South Central and such, that's a big concern. It just never really crossed my mind. I'm sure there's people listening thinking I'm an idiot by saying that, but you don't until you know.
Yeah.
What I mean. So,
and we like to think about the direct impacts of the fire, like you just said. An animal will be burned, something like that. You're gonna lose property, pastures, and things like that. Or the indirect impacts, right? It's the smoke exposure that maybe you're miles away from that fire, but you still get those poor quality air days. So that's what we are interested in, how that actually affects. And we've seen that it does look like very much that animal is sick from a pathogen, a disease, but not necessarily it is. So that's something I would like to be able to help producers with differentiating when they are sick or not.
It's just one more challenge to think about, just another thing on our plates or on the to-do list or headache, I guess, that's associated with having cattle, I guess. So something that seems interesting, another interesting facet of the virtual fencing is that it seems like if you can keep them more contained to where you want them, you can almost have like more detailed control of your herd, and not just like, well, I need the whole herd to be in this pasture because this is 100 acres and they're going to go here. You know, can you have a more finite control of your herd or management of your herd with it?
Yeah, that's an excellent question too. And we tend to say that in virtual fencing, you actually have a little bit more flexibility to work to the individual level, to one single animal than the entire herd. Of course, you can manage to the herd, but it also gives you flexibility to work specifically to that animal. And so you can manage more precisely, I would say. And one another thing that we've been doing with virtual fencing, that's been helpful in studies, is to use virtual fence to move animals. So on our methane emissions project, our cows are using virtual fence collars. So whenever we need to move them from a pasture to another, we can make like little boundaries, like create a road for them with virtual fence, and then we easily move them without having them to go completely crazy the way we wanted them to go. So a little bit more management to the animal level, I would say.
That is very not, again, another thing I hadn't thought of, but like, so when we move, I'm just thinking of all the ways that this would be applicable at my house. And so, but we have a large crop field that borders our place. We don't own it. We lease it sometimes in the winter and let the cows graze that crop residue, but we have to cross a railroad to get there. It's an active railroad and the trains come most of the time, like every 20 minutes. So we have to gather them in the pasture and kind of keep them contained in this corner, and then wait till the train goes by, and then open the gate and try to get them across it, you know, so that we have that time. And there never fails. There's always one that kind of squirts off over here. And how wonderful that would be to be able to set the fencing up for that day, or just for that, 1 hour period, so that they wouldn't hustle on out when they had the chance. That's another wonderful piece of it that I hadn't thought of. So
yeah, that can be very, very, very helpful. And I know some people that do crop grazing, like post-harvest grazing, are using to kind of rotate grazing too in those areas. So that might be another opportunity too. So
yeah,
like create a rotational grazing in the larger pasture, right?
Yeah, I will admit that's that what had attracted me to it first was the rotational grazing bit, because we have the grass that we run on. And again, I'm talking about how it affects me. So this is what you have to listen to, but we have large pastures that we rotate through, but like sometimes the herd, they're only on it for 2 weeks. They stay in one part of it and they don't really go to another section of the pasture. They just kind of concentrate there. So then you have the grass grazed down pretty tight in this one, half of this 80-acre pasture. And then the other 40 acres have grown up, which is wonderful there. But then you have this uneven growth. And that's what had really intrigued me about it to begin with, was we could make them graze it evenly for the most part. So I find that's just a really valuable piece. I hope the audience that's listening can tell that I am really geeked out about this. And I hope they're listening to all the applicable ways that you've shared, that this could be really valuable on a farm or a ranch.
Here, we don't do rotational grazing here. We're doing a little bit. It's not even a rotational graze. We are like monitoring grazing for our studies, but somewhat like similar to rotational graze or target grazing. That's how I should call it, actually. What we are doing here in another project is we use the rangeland platform analysis, and that tells you what are the fire-prone areas of your range, so where we have more biomass available. So what we're doing is, like, within a larger within a larger pasture, let's say it's a 400-acre pasture, we created smaller boundaries where we have more biomass and make them to graze the area to remove the biomass and make it less prone to fire. So that's another way to use the technology. I think it's like the idea is like it's limitless, right? Like you just have to be creative, and I'm sure you're gonna find a use for it. There's so many ways to use it.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, the opportunities seem really endless in terms of ways that it can work. You don't have to use not all of the applications are going to be relevant to every person, every ranch, but there is at least one application that could be really relevant to everyone. So
Exactly.
it's really interesting. So
It's time for our famous three.
well, we have reached a point in our in the interview where we ask the same questions of every guest. And you've already answered these though with Dr. Mullenix, but maybe you'll have different answers this time around. You know, maybe you're reading a different book, but you knew that these were coming. I haven't sprung these on you at the last minute. So our first closing question is, what is your favorite beef or cattle related resource? Could be a book, a person, a website. You know, what is that?
Yeah, so I think my answer haven't changed, but I do. So as a good extension personnel, I always rely on people. So I will, if there's a question I don't know, I usually tend to ask the extension folks around me to help with, or publications from the extension sometimes can be very helpful too. And then tend to go to manuscript, scientific literature, and then go back to those in the nutrition requirements book and feeds books. They're very valuable too. Big fan of podcasts. I like podcasts. I like to be on them and I like to listen to them. So I usually listen to one every morning coming to work or something like that. So I think those would be, my recommendations. So extension personnel, extension publications, scientific publications, and then there's multiple podcasts out there, including this one there. It's really great.
Well, we appreciate you listening to the podcast. I think that I keep saying I think my extension person probably wishes that there's two of them that I call. They were not such great resources to me because they probably get tired of me calling them because I use this so much.
No, we like questions. Keep bringing questions. That's important.
Okay. Well, when they get if they start screening my calls, I'm going to say, Dr. Ranches told me that it was okay to call you. So, all right. So moving on, what is your favorite non-beef or cattle related book or one that you are currently reading?
Yeah. So I think I told Travis on our conversation that my favorite was Educated. It's a book about someone that was prevented from going to school, was homeschooled, and then had the opportunity to go to school, and how the life of that person changed. So it's a real story book, and I think it's really interesting. Very, very. It makes you think about the opportunities you have in life if you're in academia, if you have the opportunity to go to school, right? But I recently finished one that's called Outliers, and my gosh, I love that one. I would recommend to anyone. It's a book that talk about people that are outliers and what makes them to be outliers, and how much sometimes I think it's just like, oh, this person is lucky, and no, it's not like that. There's multiple factors that make someone to be an outlier. And I think, if let's go with this one for this round. Outliers, really good one.
You're not the first person to say that book. I mean, it's can really be life-changing and really impactful for people. Like, I mean, I haven't heard anybody who's read it who said, oh, that was a waste of time. That it really does have an impact on people.
And I was actually reading the Bill Gates one while listening to Outliers. I'm like, oh my gosh, those two together, very good combination.
Right. Yes. I mean, it's just very relatable.
Yeah.
So the last one is, when you think of someone you admire or look up to, what is a characteristic they possess that has led them to be successful? And you don't have to tell us the name of the person, just the characteristic.
I think the first time I got that question, I was like, what are you talking about, Travis? I think it was a good question, but I feel like people that are outliers, let's say, or there are people that I look at as an inspiration, are often people that are brave. they don't give up. Life can be really hard. The success rate compared to the failure rate, it's like completely disproportional, right? Like you're gonna fail multiple times. So I think like all the people that I think are successful and have done well in life, they have way more failures than success. So I think that's it. Like, is someone that doesn't give up, is someone that keeps fighting for it and has innovative ideas and believe in what they're doing and keep pursuing those ideas. I think that's basically what it is.
Yeah, I mean, perseverance is so important. I mean, in a career, whether you're in academia, whether you're in industry, whether you're self-employed, that's really valuable. And it's an intangible but very valuable asset for sure.
I agree. I definitely agree.
Well, that is all the questions and time that we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us again today on the Beef Podcast, Dr. Ranches. If listeners have questions for you or want to learn more about our discussion today, where can they do that?
Yeah, I'll be happy to talk to anyone that has questions. They can either get in contact with you or email me. I'll be happy to answer questions, maybe have a Zoom meeting or anything that it's needed to help. Then I'll be happy to help. And thanks for having me. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, I really, really, really enjoyed it. And you heard it, folks, that she will be happy to answer all your virtual fencing questions and nerd out with you like I did as we got down into the deep nitty gritty of it. I want to thank you again, Dr. Ranches, for being here. And to our audience, thank you for tuning in this week. And we'll meet you back here next week on the Beef Podcast presented by Wisenetics. This is Brandy Buzzard saying, until next time.